My name is Angelette Tucker. I teach sociology of religion at the School of Theology. And believe it or not, I got into the religion business through international relations, so I was eating all of that up. Yeah. Anywho, I'm a faculty in residence who works in South Campus at 514 Park Drive. You may have seen us yesterday. Woohoo, South Campus. May have seen us yesterday at Pavement Coffee House having a meet and greet with the owner of Pavement right next to CVS. He's a BU grad, believe it or not. So drink lots of coffee there. Anywho, I'm delighted to introduce the last anchor in this lecture relay race. Dr. Sweeting is with us today. He's the acting chair of humanities and associate professor of humanities. His writing and research interests focus on the overlap of natural and cultural forces in American life, with a particular focus on bringing humanities disciplines into conversations about global climate change. He's written several books. His most recent, Beneath the Second Sun, A Cultural History of Indian Summer, explores the numerous ways that Indian summer weather has been experienced and portrayed in poetry, folklore, painting, and popular imagination. And he's currently working on a book devoted to climate change and New England culture. Let's welcome Dr. Sweeting.
Well, thank you. This really has been great, and I've enjoyed the talks from my colleagues, and seeing so many students here is really terrific. I'm going to do something a little bit different than my colleagues have, and I see one or two of my former students out there who are going to be shocked, because I'm actually going to use a couple of PowerPoint slides. I'm well known, to the extent that I'm well known on this campus, for leading a relatively low-tech class. We tend to sit down with a text and read it very, very carefully and discuss it. But I wanted to spend a little time today talking about a book project that was just alluded to and describe sort of what I'm up to, because it's not a straightforward academic book that I'm working on. The title of it is called Tropical New England, Essays on the Cultural Implications of Climate Change in New England. And I am not a scientist. I'm a literary scholar by training. I have written on Henry David Thoreau and Emily Dickinson. I've developed an interest in sort of environmental writing, and mostly environmental writing from the 19th century. I'm also, as my few students out there will remember, I'm a passionate environmentalist. I guess I am as close to a tree hugger as it gets. And I've been looking for ways to combine this interest, because my great fear, as many of us, you young people in particular, need to be concerned about it, is climate change as the 20th century or 21st century unfolds. And so I started doing some traveling around New England. I will not torture you with the pictures of me and my children in different spots of troubled areas in New England, but some of them will appear in the book that I'm working on. And what I try to do in this book is to imagine what New England might look like in 50 to 75 years based on some of the scientific evidence that we have now, some of which we heard at the very beginning of our evening tonight. And that's actually kind of a risky move for someone like a cultural historian. And I'm not a historian, lots of knots here. But cultural historians are trained not to project into the future too much, because it's vague. They're supposed to look in the back toward the past. But I wanted to gaze into the future a little bit, while at the same time rereading some classic New England texts, some classic New England authors, and the ones that I focus on in this book. And it's sort of a travelogue. It moves in and out of time sequences. It goes back into the 19th century, into the 21st century. But I focus a lot on Henry David Thoreau, Emily Dickinson, Robert Frost, and a few others. So I thought I would, if I could, these are just so you know, here are some facts. I'm not going to read them to you. Here are some data that I have culled. I have just sort of taken this from the popular press, some scientific. These are some things that are happening now in New England. Climate change is here. Temperatures have increased on average by 4.4 degrees since 1970. Down at the bottom, New England has actually seen some of the warmest trends over the last 100 years or so. Data going back to 1912, Rhode Island and Massachusetts have warmed faster than any other states in the United States. We've seen the collapse of the lobster fishery in Rhode Island and Connecticut, the lobster fishery is very much under threat. In Maine, as waters get colder, as waters get warmer, cold water species such as lobster have a much more difficult time. So what I'm doing here in this book is to look at a series of iconic New England industries, iconic New England landscapes, such as skiing, the fall foliage, shell fishing, apple picking. Apples, 50, 75 years from now, most of the beloved apples that we have here in New England, particularly McIntosh and Baldwin, probably will not be able to grow because they won't have the sufficient winter chill. They each need up to 1,000 hours of what they call winter chill each winter, and they won't have that. So some of these apples won't be here. So that's just some of the facts. If we could move ahead. This is what some people predict. This is from the Union of Concerned Scientists of what the climate in New England will look like as we move through the 21st century. And you will notice that there are two different scenarios. One's called the higher emission scenario and the lower emission scenario. This is sort of the standard way that climate scientists try to project looking forward. It's based on a series of very complex modeling. The higher emission scenario is basically if we don't cut emissions, if we keep at our current rate. The lower emissions scenario is if we're able to reduce. There's more to it than that, but that's in a nutshell. And you will see, if you just take a look at New Hampshire, what the climate of New Hampshire from 1960 to about 1990, you can see by the end of the 21st century, it's quite possible that we will be, those of us who are still alive at the end of the 21st century, New Hampshire will be much like modern North Carolina. So there are some big changes coming our way. So let's, if I could, turn to, these are again just some of the predicted changes. We'll move through. I want to get to some of the poems here. And this is really sort of the heat of the book, the heart of the book. I take it for granted. I have the starting point that climate change is real, that humans are causing it, that there are substantial changes on the way. I do not get involved with the climate change deniers. I am taking this as a fact and as a reality. But what I want to look at are poems. And here's a poem by Robert Frost. It's only part of it. It's a much longer poem, and I didn't want to read the whole thing. But it's After Apple Picking from his North of Boston collection. And what I've done, unfortunately, this didn't come out, but it's paired with a photograph of a destroyed apple orchard after the 1938 hurricane, which passed through central New England. And we just experienced the 75th anniversary of it 2 or 3 days ago. Most weather historians say that it was the worst weather event in the history of New England, the great 1938 hurricane. And so the poem is, and this is just part of it, and unfortunately I don't sound like Robert Frost. I wish I did. My long two-pointed ladders sticking through a tree toward heaven still, and there's a barrel that I didn't fill beside it. And there may be 2 or 3 apples I didn't pick upon some bough. But I am done with apple picking now. Essence of winter sleep is on the night. The scent of apples, I am drowsing off. I cannot rub the strangeness from my sight I got from looking through a pane of glass I skimmed this morning from the drinking trough and held against the world of hoary grass. What's happening here is Frost is, the speaker of this poem, is recalling a day of hard work picking apples in a sort of idyllic New England scene. And he's weary, and he announces that he's done with apple picking now. And I sort of take that, and there's much more to the poem. It goes into sort of reflections on his own mortality, reflections on his own creative process, reflections on the changing seasons and the ladder moving through the wind. But I really zero in on this line, I am done with apple picking now, because what I want to think about in this book and what I'm trying to work on in sort of a non-academic way is, might that be possible? Might we have a world in New England 50 or 75 years from now where all of us are done with apple picking now? And of course, Frost wasn't thinking about climate change, and by no means do I want to say that he is a climate change prophet, because he was not. But it's a way to sort of go, for me, it's a way to go back and look at sort of a classic text and ask myself and perhaps other readers, how might we reread this poem in light of change that we know is going to come? It's almost a future elegy. Some literary critics have, elegy is generally sort of to mourn what's past, but now we might be in the position of mourning what will pass eventually. Can we take a look at another poem here? One of the implications of climate change that's already here in New England is we've seen birds arriving much, much later in the spring, migratory birds, particularly birds that migrate a long, long distance, say from South America. There are a number of birds that migrate from the southern United States, but a large number migrate every year, and they have for thousands and thousands of years from South America. Among them is the ruby-throated hummingbird, which now arrives 18 days earlier each year, on average, over the last 10 or 15 years. It's arriving about 18 days earlier than it did historically. And you might wonder, well, who cares if a bird is arriving a little bit earlier? Well, I went back and I noticed that, and I'm not alone, many people have noticed that Emily Dickinson wrote quite extensively about hummingbirds. There was sort of a group of authors in the mid-19th century who were quite fond of hummingbirds. But the hummingbird might not be in New England in 50 or 75 years. But even if it is, if it does manage to come earlier every year, 18 days earlier, 20 days earlier, 25 days earlier, and there's some wonderful work being done here at Boston University by Professor Richard Primack in the biology department. And I'm drawing, and he and I have conversed quite a bit on this. But if the hummingbirds are arriving differently than the early, the insects upon which they feed may not be blooming at the same time, the flowers might not be, so we're going to have what they call ecological mismatches. And so we're going to have a new suite of species. But the ruby-throated hummingbird is one of the most obvious examples. So what I do here, I have a painting of hummingbirds from Martin Johnson Head, the great 19th century American painter, that I pair with an Emily Dickinson poem. And then I write about this notion of ecological mismatch and how we might have to adjust for it, and how our experience of the spring every year. Bird watchers go out. I'm not a bird watcher, but I'm good friends with several, or I'm not a devoted one. I watch them, but devoted bird watchers keep deep logs, and they keep counts, and they measure, they record when they saw the first hummingbird, when they saw the first whatever it is each spring. And those logs are invaluable research tools, and we're going to see that they're going to change over time. Unfortunately, Henry David Thoreau, who's one of my all-time favorite writers, wrote some of his clunkiest prose about Billingsgate Island. So I'm not going to bore you with reading his prose about Billingsgate Island. But Billingsgate Island was, I should say, a small little island off, and I'm going to jump over here, the southern tip here of Wellfleet Point down here on Cape Cod. And it is no longer there. It has been overflown from rising sea levels. And there used to be a small community out on Billingsgate Island. There was, this is the old lighthouse that was there. There was a small school there. There were, as late as 1900, there were 34 houses on Billingsgate Island. And one of the things I do in the book is I go back and I've dug up several 17th century references to Billingsgate Island. And of course, there's Thoreau, and it's not a great passage from him, and he didn't really write it in his beautiful journals, unfortunately. So it doesn't have the resonance as I would hope. But the notion of an island right off the coast of New England that's no longer here, that is already gone, that disappeared in about 1937, and you can still go out at very, very low tide. You can go out, if you're a brave enough kayaker, you can go out and you can walk and you can climb up on top of some of the ruins that are still there. And you can get a sense, it's almost like being in a ghost town. And there's much of this sort of ghost-like imagery that we may have to just sort of think about. New England's not going to disappear. Trees will still be here. Birds will still be here. Well, I don't know about apples, but some fruits will still be here. But it's going to be very, very, very different. And I wanted to try to capture that in some way. This is a wonderful, beautiful poem by Robert Lowell, who taught here at Boston University. And I'm just going to read the first couple of lines. It was a Maine lobster town. Each morning, boatloads of hands pushed off for granite quarries on the islands. And Lowell moved back and forth between Boston and Maine. And he wrote several poems about the coast of Maine and the lobster communities that are there. This is a painting by the great Maine-born painter Marsden Hartley. And I sort of pair this up. And the lobster industry is one of those real iconic New England industries. It's deeply rooted in our culture here. And it's already gone in southern New England. There's a number of reasons why that might be the case, but part of it is disease and sort of shell shock that happened, but also really the warming waters off of those coasts, and that is moving further north. And I wonder how students sitting in my HU 102 class in 2050, where we do read Robert Lowell's Water, will they read it in the same way? So if I could just look at one more slide here. This is Anne Sexton, another BU faculty member from the 1960s, who wrote a poem, Oysters. Unfortunately, the best Oysters poem was written by Seamus Heaney, the great Irish poet who just passed away, but he did not write about American oysters. And I pair this poem, it's actually a poem about eating oysters with your father in a kind of a scary situation. She had a complex relationship with her father, and she describes being 15 years old and eating this adult food for the first time with her father at the Union Oyster House. Now, why oysters? Oysters, like many shellfish in New England, are facing serious risk as a result of what's called ocean acidification. As more and more carbon comes into the ocean, shellfish like oysters and scallops, which are deeply emblematic in New England, cannot build, or they have much more difficulty building their shells, and particularly the larvae. So there's real fear, pardon me, that the shellfish industry in New England, it will also pass. It's really under risk already in the Pacific Northwest. And I pair that with a photograph of a Native American shell pile in Maine that's well over 1,000 years old, just to show, and that's about 30 feet high of oyster shells. The people have been eating oysters here in New England for thousands and thousands of years, building these huge piles of oyster shells. And they might not be in 50 or 60 years, or at least they won't be eating oysters that were raised here in our waters. So just to sum up, why am I doing this? I'm a trained humanist. I'm a trained literary scholar. And people, New England will get through climate change. This is one of the most well-off parts of the whole world. Climate change is really going to have, from a social impact, it's going to really impact people in much poorer places than New England. Bangladesh, low-lying countries, low-lying island nations, poor people in South America, Central America. They're the folks who are in Africa are going to bear the real brunt of climate change as the 20th century unfolds. So it might seem selfish, perhaps, to focus on these little things here in New England. But I'm reminded of a passage that the great American novelist Henry James wrote early in the Second World War, when he was, not Henry James, his biographer, F.A.O. Matheson, who was writing a biography of Henry James. And Matheson was teaching at Harvard in the early 1940s, and he was kind of lambasted for not joining in the war effort, even as his young students ran off and many of them died. And he wrote this small little thing in his autobiography that remaining at Harvard and working on his biography of Henry James was kind of his small contribution to the war effort. It's what he could do. And so I sometimes think as a humanities scholar, as a humanities teacher who's deeply involved in thinking about New England, that's what I can do. I can bring attention to how iconic experiences in New England will be altered through time. And the book ends up being sort of a meditation on time, on New England literature, on memory, our memories of the past. I've said this in many public settings. I'm working on this book with my child coming along at the same time where both of my parents are now quite elderly and sick. And so there's an element of sadness and elegy in the book that is driving my thinking about New England and climate change and the future that all of you will inherit. So thank you.
That you traveled throughout Massachusetts doing research on different poets and whatnot. I was just wondering the different places that you visited and what you learned from that.
Sure. Well, I've been out. I've spent quite a bit of time out in Amherst, which was the home of Emily Dickinson. Quite a bit of time in Concord and where Thoreau lived. I have probably swam in Walden Pond this past summer 15 or 20 times, and I would go every morning with my daughter. Not literally, not every morning if we only did it, but you get the picture, 2 or 3 times a week. Been up to Maine several times, the Lowell, so the lobster areas. Fascinating trip that took a couple of weeks ago to an abandoned area just outside of Gloucester, up on Cape Ann, called Dogtown, which is this wild kind of abandoned village just outside of Gloucester. And it's an old fishing community. And what happened is the people in the early 19th century moved down in. And what I like about it is it's a landscape carved entirely by ice. I didn't even mention that at all. But New England is really created by the cold. It's created by glaciers at the end of the last ice age. And it's going to be fundamentally altered by warmth. So I went up and I checked out this glacier-carved landscape in Gloucester, which was home to Marsden Hartley, also one of the painters we looked at earlier. I've been down to Connecticut talking with shellfishermen, oystermen, to Rhode Island. I've been to a place called Scallop Town, which is an old kind of abandoned, literally it was a scallop fishing community in Rhode Island. Which is now sort of more of a quahog community, but there's these great old pictures that I found in the Providence Journal in the library of Scallop Town, and so it's just been kind of all over, and it's really been interesting, and it's helped me understand. I'm not a native New Englander. I grew up in New York, but I've spent more than half my life. I've been in New England now since I was 20, well, really 18. I went to college here, and here I still am. So I won't tell you how old I am, but I've been here more than half my life, and so I'm not native, but it's become my home. Yes.
Hello.
Oh, there you go.
All right. So you seem to sort of present this change in climate to be sort of a definite inevitability, but I'm wondering if you foresee any sort of like technological advances that may either prevent this from happening or at least will make it so that we can still have things like oysters and things like apples and anything like that. Like, is there a model that accounts for that?
Well, I mean, a lot of this is, of course, projection, right? And if we can reduce, and I'm not the technician here, but if we can reduce the emissions and we have more, say, winter warmth, apples, iconic New England apples, such as the McIntosh, will still be here. We'll get different apples. There are now apples that grow only in Georgia, which will probably grow up here in the next 50 or 60 years. They'll be different. Is that good or bad? I'll leave that for the people in 50 or 60 years to decide. But we do have this this concept of what a New England orchard looks like. Although, ironically, New England orchards are fairly recent inventions, really since after the 1938 hurricane, when most of the apple trees were destroyed. In the 19th century, people grew apples primarily for cider, because that was the alcohol of choice in the 19th century, not beer or wine. It was cider. And so apple trees were grown in New England so people could drink hard cider. And it was after, really, the Second World War that what we now think are the old orchards came into being. But your question is a good one. I mean, do we have technical solutions? I think there are. But there's really, I know Professor Basevich was cautious of using the term, but it's a moral solution, right? That we collectively have to make decisions about our future. What sort of future do we want to leave to our children and our grandchildren? And that's not really a technical solution. I mean, Garrett Hardin, the ecologist, wrote that there are no technological solutions to certain problems. And there are, I mean, the admissions technology can be improved, wind technology, all of these things that we've read about, and we need to work on them, we need to invest on them. But ultimately, I think it's a moral solution. I think that human beings have to think about what kind of planet they want to inhabit. And I think of myself, I've become a New Englander, and I'm rooted in a place. And I very much believe that if people become rooted in a place, if they know the history of that place, if they have some sense of how that place got to be that place, both historically, economically, and ecologically, they have a deeper stake in it, and they will change. So I'm an optimist that people will change. So I guess that's it. Well, thank you very much. I guess I'm it.